Most people have heard of H H Holmes, perhaps as America's first serial killer, the Chicago Ripper, the Devil in White City, or even as a Jack the Ripper suspect. Famous for building a murder castle in Chicago, Illinois, it's believed that he used it to torture and kill up to 200 people. He confessed to killing 27 and would also say that he was possessed by the devil. Jeff Mudgett put H H Holmes forward as a Jack the Ripper suspect when, aged 40, he learned that Holmes was his great-great-grandfather. He became obsessed, leading him to research the crimes and found evidence linking the two. Many have dismissed H H Holmes as a serious Jack the Ripper suspect, but putting this to one side, H H Holmes is a very interesting case in his own right. And I don't think we can do one without the other. So we'll talk about H H Holmes first before getting into the Jack the Ripper allegations, and I'll add a chapter straight to that section in the description. H H Holmes was actually born Herman Webster Mudgett on the 16th of May 1861 in Gilmanton, New Hampshire. He was the third of 5 children to Levi Mudgett, a farmer and later a postmaster, and Theodate Price. There are accounts that Herman and his siblings had a difficult family life. His parents were devout Methodists, but his father was a heavy drinker and mistreated the family. However, this account has been disputed because it's also been reported that they had a normal, happy family life. He attended Phillips Exeter Academy, going on to Gilmanton Academy. He was reported to be an excellent student, though he had no close friends and was bullied by his classmates. Holmes would later recount a story where 2 older boys would drag him into a doctor's office and make him stand looking at and touching a human skeleton. The boys expected the experience to scare Holmes, and at first it did, but the longer he stood there staring at the skeleton, the more it intrigued him, and this would cause him to have a fascination with death, and he began dissecting animals. He graduated with honours from Gilmanton Academy in 1877. Age 16, he met Clara Loverin at a church social event, and the two became an item. On the 4th of July 1878, at the age of 17, the two secretly married, though they would continue living at the respective parents. After a few months, they confessed the marriage to the parents. Both sets disapproved, but Clara's father gave Herman a job working in a grocery store that he owned. In 1879, he enrolled at the University of Vermont. Clara by then was pregnant and remained with her parents. However, Holmes would leave the university after only a year. On the 3rd of February 1880, the couple welcomed a son, Robert, and later that year, Holmes enrolled at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, at the Department of Medicine and Surgery, although this time Clara and the son accompanied him, and the family would live in a boarding house. Despite graduating high school with honours, Holmes's academic performance at university was average. He may have been distracted. After all, he now had a wife and baby competing for his study time. However, it appears that he was distracted by something else, because allegedly this is when his criminal career began. Holmes began working in the anatomy lab under the chief anatomy instructor, Dr. Herman, and he became involved in grave robbing. Holmes would sell these bodies as medical cadavers to pay for his university fees and living expenses. Holmes was unpopular with his university classmates for several reasons. He could be unpleasant, and he also had a reputation for being smelly. Despite this though, and despite being married, he was very popular with the ladies. He became involved with a widow, a Mrs. Fitch, and allegedly he promised to marry her. However, when she found out that he was already married, she tried, unsuccessfully, to sue him. During this time, his relationship with Clara deteriorated. Witnesses would later come forward to say that the two constantly argued, and Clara was often seen with bruises. She eventually had enough though, and she left with Robert, returning to live with her parents. In 1884, Holmes graduated, becoming a doctor, though he would only just scrape by. After graduation, Holmes returned to New Hampshire to live with his parents before moving to Moores, New York, where he took a job as a doctor. He earned a bad reputation there for his treatment methods, his refusal to pay huge debts, and a vaccine con. During this time, a boy went missing, and witnesses would say that they had seen him with Holmes, and Holmes left. After this, Holmes moved from place to place doing various jobs, including one at a state hospital in Philadelphia, where he would stay only 2 months. He then moved to Minneapolis, where he met and began a relationship with Martha Belknap. He did try to divorce Clara, citing that she had been unfaithful to him, but this was unsuccessful because there were no witnesses to confirm this infidelity. He didn't let it stop him though. He married Martha anyway. In August 1886, the couple moved to Chicago, and this is where he took on the name Henry Howard H H Holmes, perhaps in an attempt to distance himself from his past and his debtors. Holmes soon found a job at a drugstore on the corner of South Wallace Avenue and West 63rd Street in the Englewood section of Chicago. The drugstore was owned by a Dr. Elizabeth Holton, and Holmes did well there. Business was good, even attracting women who travelled to the drugstore simply to see Holmes. In 1887, Dr. Holton sold the drugstore to Holmes. He had greater ambitions though. He had his eye on an empty plot of land opposite the drugstore. He bought it later that year, and in August, building work commenced. Holmes planned a building that would house a new drugstore. There would be space for other shops and stores on the ground floor, apartments on the second, and a hotel on the third. And this would later become known as his murder castle. The ground and second floors were soon completed, and Holmes moved in. He had relied on loans from investors for completing his building, and Holmes refused to pay these debts. There were disputes over the building. The steel company, Etna Iron and Steel, commenced legal action against Holmes in 1888. Holmes transferred ownership of the building to his wife Martha and then to his mother-in-law to protect it from the lawsuits, which would number 60 in total. There were numerous hidden rooms contained in the building where Holmes would hide unpaid for, stolen furniture. He would buy this furniture on credit, sell it, and then refuse to pay for it. There was also a scam where Holmes sold healthy bottled mineral water, which in reality was sourced from the mains water in his building. In 1890, Holmes set up a glass bending company in a 1-story factory with a furnace. Keep that in mind. There was no glass bending going on, but the furnace was being used. It was around this time that he met Benjamin Peitzel, a former criminal who had invented a coal bin and was renting space in the factory. The two became close friends and even committed several cons together. On the 4th of July 1889, Holmes became a father again when Martha gave birth to a daughter, Lucy. Still, this didn't stop his interest in other women. In September 1889, Ned Connor, his wife Julia, and their 5-year-old daughter Pearl moved into one of the apartments. Holmes gave Julia a job at the pharmacy, and the two soon began an affair. When Connor learned of the affair, he left his wife and daughter in March 1890. They remained at the apartment, and Holmes and Julia continued their relationship. Holmes sold Julia a part of the drugstore and then sued her for it. He tried to reassure her that this was just a formality, but Julia was having doubts, and finally she began to tell friends. Julia and Pearl were last seen on the 24th of December 1891 when visiting friends. They were due to return the next day and celebrate Christmas with them, but they would never arrive. The disappearance was soon noted, and Holmes told anybody that asked that Julia had gone to visit her sister. Soon after, Holmes tried to rent out Julia's apartment, and the prospective tenant noticed that Julia's personal effects were still there. Holmes would later say that Julia had become pregnant and she had died when he had tried to perform an abortion. Abortions were illegal and highly dangerous at the time, and it wasn't uncommon for women to die whilst undergoing these procedures. Pearl was a loose end that would highlight the fact that Julia was gone, and a partial skeleton of a little girl believed to be Pearl was found buried in the basement several years later. In May 1892, 23-year-old Emmeline Sigrand began working for Holmes as a secretary. The two began an affair. Holmes promised that he would leave his wife, But Emmeline began to see that this would never happen. It was perhaps this that helped her see past his charm, and she began to lose interest in the relationship. She was never seen again after December that year. Holmes said that she had married a man by the name of Robert Phelps. He even had a wedding announcement placed in the local newspaper and claimed that the couple had moved to England. Authorities later believed that Emmeline may have become pregnant by Holmes and, like Julia, had died during a failed abortion. Emmeline's body was never found, and it was believed that she had been incinerated in the furnace. 1893 heralded the World's Fair in Chicago, and Holmes secured more investors, with plans to develop the third floor further to accommodate the numerous visitors that the fair would bring. In reality, though, he pocketed the money, took out several insurance policies, and planned to burn it down. In early 1893, Holmes hired a former actress, Minnie Williams, as his secretary, and the two began an affair. Minnie was from Fort Worth, Texas, where she owned property, and Holmes persuaded her to sign it over to him, or rather an alias of his, Alexander Bond. In May 1893, posing as a married couple, Holmes and Williams rented an apartment in Lincoln Park. In June, Minnie's 18-year-old sister Anna visited. The girl's parents had passed away, and Anna wrote a letter to her aunt telling her of plans to accompany Brother Harry, Holmes, to Europe, and that, "Brother Harry says you need never trouble any more about me, financially or otherwise. He and sister will see to me. I hope our hard days are over." After the 5th of July 1893, neither Minnie or Anna were ever seen again, and Holmes would later go on to use Minnie's name in future scams. On the 13th of August 1893, a fire broke out at the building. Holmes had removed all of the valuables from the building the day before. He almost certainly set the fire with the help of Peitzel, who had fled to Indiana. Holmes was immediately suspected, and the insurance company refused to pay out. He was finally arrested in January 1894. Holmes confessed that he had used an alias to take out the insurance policies, but denied arson. Soon after this, Holmes fled to Denver with Georgiana Yoke, a former school teacher who he had met the year before at the World's Fair. There, the two married, he for the 4th time, on the 17th of January 1894. From there, they travelled to Fort Worth, Texas, where they met up with Benjamin Peitzel. Holmes planned to build another building on the land inherited from the Williams sisters. Once building work began, Holmes again refused to pay the builders, and as one group quit, he hired another to take the place. And he continued with his schemes. He bought various types of goods on credit, sold them on, and then failed to repay the loans. However, in June 1894, he abandoned Texas for Missouri. Many locals in Fort Smith had known the Williams sisters and had become suspicious of how he'd come to be in possession of the land, and also the noted absence of the sisters themselves. In July 1894, Holmes was arrested for selling mortgaged goods and briefly jailed for the first time. There, he met a man by the name of Marion Hedgepeth, who was serving a 25-year sentence for train robbery. Holmes concocted another insurance scheme. He planned to fake his own death and use a cadaver for identification of his body, then collect on the insurance payout. He promised Hedgepeth $500 of the proceeds in return for details of a crooked attorney who he could trust. Hedgepeth delivered, putting Holmes in touch with an attorney, Jephthah Howe, who liked the scheme and agreed to take part. Unfortunately for the men, the insurance company grew suspicious and refused to pay out. Holmes wasn't deterred though. He moved straight to another plan. They would move to Philadelphia, where Peitzel would set himself up as an inventor by the name of B.F. Perry. Perry would be killed in a lab explosion. A cadaver would be used for the identification of the body, and Mrs. Peitzel would collect the $10,000 life insurance policy, which would be split between Holmes, Howe, and Peitzel. Rather than sourcing a body, Holmes killed Peitzel on the 4th of September 1894. Peitzel's wife Carrie identified the body as Perry, not knowing she was actually identifying her husband. Holmes now had two problems. Firstly, he needed an explanation as to where Peitzel was. And secondly, he didn't want to share the money and decided that he would keep it for himself. Holmes told Mrs. Peitzel that her husband was hiding in London and that in order to prevent any suspicion, they would need to split up and move around before he could reunite with them. He persuaded her to let him take 3 of her 5 children, Alice, aged 13, Jeanette, Nellie, 9, and Howard, 7. They travelled throughout the northeast of the States and Canada, and he moved Carrie and the other 2 children along a similar route at the same time, all with various aliases. And unbelievably, while all this was going on, Holmes was staying with his wife, Georgiana, who had no clue. On the 10th of October 1894, Holmes purchased drugs which he used to poison Howard Peitzel. He then dismembered and burned him. He murdered Alice and Nellie on the 25th of October 1894 by forcing them into a large trunk and locking them inside. He then drilled a hole in the lid, inserted the end of a hose and attached the other to a gas line. He buried them in the cellar of his house on St. Vincent Street in Toronto. In the meantime, Marion Hedgepeth realised that Holmes wasn't going to give him the $500 he'd promised, and he informed the authorities of Holmes's plan. Alarm was raised over the missing children, and the Philadelphia Police Department began an investigation. Frank Geyer, the investigator assigned to the case, retraced Holmes's steps. He found the decomposed bodies of Alice and Nellie in the cellar. He also found several unsent letters written by the Peitzel children, and this led to further investigations of the Chicago property, leading to Indianapolis, where Holmes had been living in Irvington, and Howard Peitzel's teeth were discovered there in the chimney. Holmes was tracked from Philadelphia to Boston, Massachusetts, by the Pinkertons National Detective Agency, who arrested him there on the 17th of November 1894. And concerned he would try to flee the country, they held him there on an outstanding warrant for horse theft in Texas. In July 1895, the Chicago police began investigating the Englewood building. The only evidence found was a piece of human bone, possibly belonging to Julia Connor, the partial remains of a child, possibly Pearl Connor, a tuft of human hair in the chimney, and a burned gold watch chain and buttons that allegedly belonged to Minnie Williams. Unfortunately, though, this wasn't enough to convict him for these deaths. In August 1895, the murder castle was damaged in a fire. Witnesses reported seeing 2 men entering the rear of the building at 9 p.m. and running from it half an hour later, just before it went up in flames. Investigators later found a half-empty gasoline can behind the rear steps. In October 1895, Holmes was tried and convicted for the murder of Benjamin Peitzel. By then, it was also clear to most people that he had also killed the Peitzel children. He was sentenced to death. Following his conviction, Holmes was offered $7,500 by the Hearst newspaper group for his confession. Well, Holmes couldn't resist, and in the time leading up to his execution, he wrote his memoirs. He confessed to killing 27 people in Chicago, Indiana, and Toronto, and also to 6 attempted murders. However, even then it's unclear what the truth is. He claimed to have killed a Dr. Robert Leacock when they were both medical students for the insurance money. However, Leacock wouldn't die until 1889. He also claimed to have killed a Kate Durkee, who at the time was still very much alive. He stated that he employed different methods of suffocation on his victims, including gas fumes, the use of chloroform, and trapping them in an airless vault. He confessed that he had burned some victims alive and starved others to death at his murder castle. It may well be that there was an element of truth contained in these stories. However, because he was such a prolific liar, the truth will never be known. These memoirs were published on the front page of the newspapers in the days leading up to his death. 11 other people with known association to Holmes also went missing and are believed to have died at his hands. On the 12th of April 1896, the New York Journal printed a diagram of the inside and outside of the castle along with a picture of the trunk used to kill Alice and Nellie. The press named the building Holmes's murder castle, reporting secret torture chambers, trapdoors, gas chambers, and a crematorium in the basement that was set out like a maze. They reported rooms with no windows, doors that opened into brick walls, and staircases that led nowhere. And this further fueled stories that Holmes had built the murder castle with the sole purpose of luring exposition tourists to torture, kill, and then sell the skeletons to medical schools. On the 7th of May 1896, H H Holmes was hanged at the Moyamensing prison. He was calm leading up to the event itself. However, fearing grave robbers and that his body might be used for medical dissection, he requested his coffin be buried 10 feet deep and enclosed in concrete. Holmes's body was buried in an unmarked grave at the Holy Cross Cemetery in western Philadelphia in Pennsylvania. However, there has been rumours ever since that Holmes didn't really die and that his death had been faked. So aside from the fact that they were both around at the same time, albeit 4,000 miles apart, why is H H Holmes being put forward as a Jack the Ripper suspect? Well, there's a huge advocate for the theory, a man by the name of Jeff Mudgett, Holmes's great-great-grandson. Remember, Holmes had 2 children, Robert and Lucy. Given his womanising ways, it's possible that there are others who may be unaware, but Jeff Mudgett is descended from Robert Mudgett. Mudgett didn't learn of his family heritage until the age of 40 at a family dinner party. His grandmother had been convinced that the Mudgett family had descended from Confederate General Robert E. Lee. However, this turned out not to be true, and the famous ancestor was H. H. Holmes. His grandfather, Bert Mudgett, was Robert Mudgett's grandson. And when Bert Mudgett died, Jeff Mudgett claims that he inherited H. H. Holmes's diaries. Mudgett wrote a book about this called Bloodstains, but the gist of it is that the diaries begin pre-murder castle. It gives details of his life from being relatively young, including being assaulted by a priest, which is what made him the monster he would become. It also states that Holmes began killing long before his Chicago days. There are details of some of these and also some later murders and the reasons for them, often as sort of moral lessons to the victims. For example, that of a celebrated bullfighter he'd seen. Holmes noted that the fight had been unfairly staged. The bull had had ligaments in his neck cut beforehand, meaning that it couldn't properly fight. Holmes therefore kidnapped the bullfighter and tied him up, telling him that he was going to kill him, but he would allow him to fight for his survival. However, he wanted to make this fight as fair as it had been to the bull, and severed the ligaments in his wrists first. Mudgett claims that Holmes had never been executed. He had escaped from prison and another man had been hanged in his place. And Mudgett believes that this was possible due to police corruption at the time. Holmes paid for his freedom. So the diaries continue after this execution. They detail Holmes observing his descendants, watching them to see if they were suitable for some unknown purpose. He had drawn a family tree in the diary, crossing off descendants, until he came to Jeff Mudgett, whose name hadn't been crossed off, but rather circled. And there's even an entry of Holmes observing Jeff Mudgett as a very young boy. Mudgett had the handwriting analysed. The handwriting before the death and after both match known samples of Holmes's handwriting. And Mudgett writes about being haunted by Holmes, dreaming about him. He also developed epilepsy soon after inheriting the diaries, and he had visions during grand mal seizures, where he had died twice and been brought back to life. And Holmes told Mudgett things that later turned out to be true. And of course, Bloodstains sets out the reasons why Mudgett believes that Holmes was Jack the Ripper. He states that Scotland Yard believed that Jack the Ripper was an American surgeon, a known serial killer who was in London at the time trying to sell skeletons to the University of London, and he believes that that surgeon was Holmes. He claims that Holmes was conducting medical experiments on women, taking hormones from their ovaries to develop a youth serum that would extend his life. He had travelled to London with his servant, Alan, and arrived mid-August 1888, leaving just before New Year's Eve. And the purpose for his trip was to obtain specimens, that is, the ovaries of well-to-do ladies. Holmes taught Alan female anatomy during the passage to London, and once there, he oversaw the murders in Whitechapel as part of Alan's training. The mutilations were to distract from the medical aim of the attacks, and the attacks in the East End were intentionally vicious to distract from the crimes that he was performing in the West End, to obtain the specimens that he intended to use for his youth serum. Holmes wrote the Dear Boss letter to further sensationalise the murders in the East End and again distract from those in the West. And Mudgett has had this handwriting analysed as well, that of Holmes and that of the Dear Boss letter, and the experts have said that it's close. He says that the experts didn't want to say that the handwriting was an exact match because Jack the Ripper is such a touchy subject in the UK, and they didn't want to offend anybody. Of course, while some do believe that the Dear Boss letter is genuine, it's generally accepted, as it was by the police at the time, that it was a hoax. And it's believed that this was written by somebody linked to the newspapers to sensationalise the murders and sell more newspapers. Mudgett also points out that a photo fit made from the descriptions of Jack the Ripper almost exactly matches a photograph of Holmes. There's much more. If you're interested in bloodstains, I believe it's out of print now and you can only buy it second hand. But as of the date of posting, you can get it on Audible for free if you sign up for a membership. Mudgett has also given several interviews, and these can be found on the internet and even on YouTube. And there was also a TED Talk in 2015, and I'll post a link for this in the description below. Well, Jack the Ripper is considered Britain's first serial killer, and H H Holmes is considered America's first serial killer. Holmes was also known as the Chicago Ripper. Both were and remain extremely famous Victorian serial killers who became household names in their respective countries. And still both draw huge amounts of interest, despite the passage of over 100 years. Both were covered extensively by newspapers at the time, giving them almost legendary status. The press gave Jack the Ripper a name, a chilling, menacing voice who taunted authority figures and created a frenzy in the population at large. They gave Holmes a reputation of a man so bent on murder, he created a building complete with torture rooms, acid vats and furnaces. In reality, the so-called murder castle was said to be unremarkable and incomplete due to frequent disputes with builders. It could even be argued that but for the reports of the newspapers, both could have vanished into obscurity. Both have been labelled serial killers, however they're very different types of killers. Like the Ripper, Holmes appears to have had no compunction whatsoever when it comes to killing. However, with the possible exception of Emmeline and Julia, his love interests who were possibly planning to leave him, Holmes's murders were motivated by financial gain. Any injury inflicted by Holmes after death was purely to dispose of evidence that might later convict him. For Jack the Ripper, the mutilation was the purpose of the murder, with no attempt to dispose of the body. On the contrary, he posed them. Some have even argued that Holmes wasn't a serial killer. Just killing several people doesn't fit the definition. That of similar crimes committed over a period of time mainly to satisfy a psychological urge rather than a practical motive, money in Holmes's case. Despite the letter from Anna Williams to her aunt in 1894 mentioning possible travel to Europe with Holmes, there's no evidence that Holmes ever visited London, let alone in 1888. At least not yet. In 2017, H H Holmes's grave was exhumed after Jeff Mudgett obtained the court's permission to do so. The body there was positively identified as Holmes using dental records and then reinterred. In the latest interview that I could find, it appears that Jeff Mudgett believes that the body that was exhumed didn't belong to H H Holmes, and he maintains that he escaped the hangman's noose. He states that he later learned that there were discrepancies with the identification. The body was the wrong height, the wrong build, and he alludes to a mysterious family photograph taken in 1959 of his grandfather and his grandfather's brother standing on a mysterious grave outside of Los Angeles with the same initials, same stuff, and he says he'll show this to the world when the time is right. In the next video we'll be talking about the Whitechapel murders, a string of unsolved murders committed in the East End of London, beginning in April 1888 with Emma Elizabeth Smith, and ending in February 1891 with Francis Coles. Thanks for watching. I'll see you then.